Hey guys, my name's Bethany, this is Dixie, and this is going to be the first video in a series that I'm calling Disney Revisited. The plan is to eventually watch every Disney movie ever made, including the live action ones, which is over 400 at this point. But I'll be watching one of those movies a week and then making a video about that movie. I've never watched a lot of these movies on the list, especially the live action ones, so I'm excited to get to go through Disney's history. And especially for the animated tales, we're gonna go over the plot, how the plot differed from the actual fairy tale or book that it was based off of, and then a lightning round of fun facts about the movie, the production, and the story itself. Tell me in the comments down below what your favorite Disney movie is, and let's get started. This week will be, of course, Disney's first ever feature-length animated film, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. It was released on December 21st, 1937. Being that this is one of the most popular fairy tales and animated films ever made, I'm sure everyone knows the plot of Snow White, but just in case you've been living under a rock for a while, I'll quickly go over it. Snow White lives with her evil stepmother who thinks she's the hottest lady in the world. She's afraid that Snow White will be even more beautiful than she is, so she makes the little girl her maid to make her dirty and ugly, which definitely doesn't work. Just like the trope of putting glasses on the hot girl in a movie to make her look more nerdy. Every day, the queen asks her talking mirror who is the fairest of them all. The mirror always replies that the queen is, until one day it says that Snow is more beautiful than her. This makes the queen super mad, and she does what I'm sure any rational woman in her position would do. Orders Snow White should be taken into the forest and killed. As proof of her death, the queen wants Snow White's heart delivered to her in a box. Unfortunately for the queen, the huntsman can't go through with it. He tells Snow that the queen wants her dead and so she can never go back to the castle. He brings back a pig's heart in the box to trick the queen instead. In the forest, after a major freakout from some super scary trees, some woodland creatures befriend Snow White and take her to the cottage of the Seven Dwarfs, whose names are Doc, Grumpy, Happy, Sleepy, Bashful, Sneezy, and everyone's favorite, Dopey. When they return home from working the mine, the dwarfs find their cottage all clean and Snow White asleep upstairs. They let her stay because she can cook and clean, so everything is happy again. That of course doesn't last, as the queen quickly finds out that Snow White is alive when she asks her mirror again who's the fairest one of all, and the answer is still Snow White. The queen then heads on down to her creepy witch dungeon and whips up a poison apple that puts the person who eats it into a cursed coma. The only way to break the spell is from love's first kiss. The queen puts on her old hag disguise and gives the apple to Snow White. Snow falls into her magical sleep and the queen proclaims herself once again the most fair in the land. The dwarfs return to their cottage with the woodland creatures and find the queen. They chase her to the edge of a cliff and they trap her. And when she tries to summon a boulder to smash them to get away, lightning strikes the cliff and the queen falls to her death. Thus begins the long tradition of Disney villains falling off of things while dying. The dwarves return home to find Snow White in her coma, and they can't bring themselves to bury her because she's still so beautiful, so they put her in a glass coffin. They and the woodland creatures vow to watch over Snow's body for the rest of their lives. After a year, a hot prince, whom Snow White had met while alive just long enough for a musical number, learns that she is cursed. Madly in love with her, he goes to visit her. Thinking she's dead, he gives her a kiss, which of course breaks the spell, waking Snow White. As the dwarves and woodland creatures celebrate, the prince takes Snow White to his castle to live happily ever after. So let's get into some differences between the movie and the original fairy tale. The story was originally published by the Grimm brothers back in 1812, and it was in a collection of other stories that had been gathered from local European folk stories. It is believed that the tale of Snow White is actually from the Middle Ages, when it was first passed down through word of mouth. The first difference between the story and the movie is that in the story there's a really heavy emphasis on Snow's specific appearance traits. Her biological mother, whenever she's pregnant with Snow, is sitting by an ebony window frame, most likely sewing or knitting, as that's the work that a queen would be doing at the time. While she's working, the queen pricks her finger, and looking at the blood on her finger, she makes a wish that her future daughter will be white as snow, with lips as red as the blood and hair as black as the ebony window frame that she's sitting by. This is brought up several times during the tale and is a big part of why Snow White is supposed to be the fairest in the land. A second major difference is that in the story, the evil queen or evil stepmother disguises herself 3 times before she successfully kills Snow White. Her first disguise is of a peddler who is selling her new laces for her corset. The queen laces up her new corset so tightly she can't breathe, and Snow falls down unconscious. When the dwarves return, they untie the strings on the corset, allowing Snow White to be revived, and they warn her again to be a little bit more careful. The dwarves definitely seem to be a little more on top of things in the tale than in the movie. The stepmother then comes back disguised as an old widow to give her a poisoned hair comb, like one of those decorative hair combs. And when it makes contact with Snow's hair, she is poisoned and falls down unconscious again. The dwarves return for a second time and they take the comb out of her hair, thankfully in time to revive her. The third time the queen comes, she's disguised as a old peasant's wife. Snow is a little bit more wary this time, but the stepmother convinces her to eat a poisoned apple by telling the girl she would eat the other half, which was not poisoned. The queen was a good enough spellcaster that only part of the apple was poisoned. The third major difference is at the end of the story, after Snow has already died, or in the cartoon has been put into her coma. In the actual story, Snow White never actually meets the prince before she dies. He comes wandering by after she's already dead and finds her in her glass coffin. The dwarves had put an inscription on the coffin to put her name, and it proclaimed her the daughter of a king. The prince is so captivated by the dead girl that he begs the dwarves to let him take the coffin with him whenever he leaves, which is just about the creepiest thing I've ever heard, to be honest. Fortunately for all parties, the assistants that are carrying the coffin trip on a rock and the poisoned part of Snow's apple comes falling out of her mouth. She comes back to life and immediately decides to marry the man who stole her dead body from her best friends. I honestly can't decide if the missing true love's kiss is any less weird or not than what actually happens. The evil queen is invited to their royal wedding, and not realizing that it's actually Snow White until she gets there, she is so consumed by rage that she falls down dead in some versions from being overly angry. In other versions, like the Grimm stories, the stepmother is forced to dance herself to death in a pair of red-hot clogs for her sins. While I was doing my research for this video, I found a few theories of real-life women who may have been the basis for Snow White's tale, so I'll leave those links down in the description if you want to go check those out. They're actually super interesting, but pretty long, and I'll just tell you they do involve talking mirrors, one that actually still exists today, and mean stepmothers, so definitely go check it out. Walt actually came up with the idea to do a retelling of this story whenever he was 15 years old. At that time, there was a silent film version that he watched in his hometown of Kansas City. Some rejected names for the dwarves included Jaunty, Blabby, Dirty, Gabby, Biggie Wiggy, Gaspy, Gloomy, Awful, Deefy, Hoppy Jumpy, Hotsy, Nifty, and Shifty. It took 2 years to actually come up with the final animations for the Seven Dwarfs. Apparently, 6 of the dwarves' eyebrows are modeled after Walt himself, whereas Happy is the only one that has different ones and they're white and bushy. Adriana Castellati, the voice of Snow White, was 19 years old when she voiced the character, and as is pretty famously known, she signed a pretty strict contract to never again perform in a movie or on stage to keep Snow White's voice unique to that princess. Lucille Laverne was the voice of the queen, and she achieved the old hag's raspy voice by taking out her dentures whenever she was giving those lines. The voice of the magic mirror, Maroni Olson, actually had to wear a box frame cover with old drum heads on his head to get the desired sound effect. More than 2 million drawings had to be done by 750 artists before the movie was completed, and about 250,000 separate pictures are contained within the movie itself. Real makeup was even added to the animation sheets to give Snow White a lifelike appearance and her rosy cheeks. The prince was very difficult to animate, and Walt was forced to reduce his part significantly from the prominent character he was intended to be. The movie took 3 years to produce, and Walt had to mortgage his home in order to pay for production. This was because production grew to $1.5 million with the original budget of $250,000. After the film was such a success, Walt used the proceeds to build his Disney Studios in Burbank, California. Speaking of success, Snow White was the highest grossing film ever made for exactly 1 year until Gone with the Wind took its place. Everyone was pretty surprised that the film was successful, even Walt's wife Lillian, who thought the movie would bomb. It went on to win a Special Academy Award in 1939 and was given along with 7 smaller Academy Awards, one for each of the Seven Dwarfs. One of the main reasons they thought the movie would bomb is that they didn't think adults would pay to sit through a fairy tale, and they didn't think anyone would want to sit through that long of animation. This was the first ever film to release a motion picture soundtrack. And speaking of soundtrack, the songwriters composed 25 different songs, but only 7 were featured in the movie. One of the rejected songs was called Music in Your Soup. After the film's run at Radio Music Hall in New York, many of the velvet upholstery on the seats had to be replaced because children were so frightened by some of the scenes they wet themselves. This movie was apparently one of Hitler's favorites. He owned a copy and apparently showed screenings in his own personal movie theater. And lastly, Snow White has a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame, including Mickey Mouse, Donald Duck, and Winnie the Pooh. So there we are. Hopefully you enjoyed this video and learned a little bit more about Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. If you liked it, please like the video so more people can find me, and subscribe to the channel for more future Disney content. Comment down below if you know anything else about the tale or the movie, and leave comments about next week's movie, which is going to be Pinocchio. Once again, thank you so much for stopping by, and I hope you guys have a wonderful rest of your day. Bye! Yeah. Mario. Yeah. Adriana Castellati. Adriana Castellati. Hopefully I'm saying that right. Why can't I say that? Stop. For just 1 second. I just gotta get this last sentence out, okay?